The primary purpose of Uniquely Human, the podcast, is to educate and inform. The views expressed during all episodes are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute educational or medical advice. Listeners should consult with professionals familiar with each individual or family for specific guidance.
Uniquely Human, the podcast, is produced by Elevated Studio. Music is graciously provided by Matt Savage of Savage Records.
Hi, I'm Dr. Barry Prezant, clinical scholar, researcher, and consultant on autism and neurodiversity, and a Brooklyn boy raised in the big city.
And I'm Dave. I'm none of those things, and I grew up on a farm in Illinois. But being on the spectrum myself, I have plenty of personal insight to lend.
And this is Uniquely Human, the podcast, a show that illuminates and celebrates autism and neurodiversity. So Dave, today we are having a wonderful guest, and that is Terri Duncan, and we're going to share a little bit more about Terri, actually a lot more in just a few minutes. So welcome to Uniquely Human, the podcast, Terri.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And Terri is a longtime colleague. We've known each other, oh my goodness, actually going back before you developed CASE, Children's Autism Services of Edmonton. We're going to talk about that in greater detail. And you've been doing fabulous work. So let's dive right in and tell you a little bit about Terri. Terri is the founder and executive director of Children's Autism Services of Edmonton. And for our listeners who are not familiar with Edmonton, it's a city in Western Canada with a population over 1 million people. She is a speech-language pathologist and has worked with autistic children and others with a broad range of developmental delays for more than 20 years. Terri has a BA in psychology and linguistics. Hey, what kind of linguistics buddies there? From the University of Ottawa. And her master's degree in speech and language pathology from the University of Alberta. And you got started very early working with a young child, a 4-year-old child, in a family's home. And since that time, you've been fascinated by the complexity of the brain and the resilience of families dealing with the challenges they face. And I know you and the joys they experience on a daily basis. And here's something that's very important. Terri started Children's Autism Services of Edmonton in 2004. Happy 20th anniversary. It's great.
Thanks.
And since that time, the organization has grown to be the largest service provider in Western Canada and definitely one of the most respected in the world. And we are going to talk not only about the development of CASE and what you do there, but especially your latest work, which was just published by Neurodiversity Press. And the title is Why Emotional Regulation Might Mean, in capital letters, everything. Reframing behavior. So, Terri, tell us a little bit about your background. Well, we heard a little bit about that, but how that led to the development of Children's Autism Services of Edmonton, which from now on we'll refer to as CASE.
Yeah, thanks so much for the lovely intro. And it's been actually since the early 2000s that I've known you. We actually met in Comox, BC, when you were first presenting, and it was before the CERTS manuals were published, but I had followed your work and followed your work on echolalia and your early work in speech pathology for years. And so it was just such a joy to meet you. And then to find out what a kind and giving and fabulous human you were then was just, was great. And you've been a mentor, and our program is based on the CERTS model. So that was one of the key points in my development as a professional and in our organization's development. But again, as you mentioned before that, I was working with a 4-year-old in his home in the early 90s, back when I used to say I worked in autism, and people said, "What's that?" And they'd never even heard the word. So that really gave me that piece of of family involvement. The parent of that 4-year-old actually created a home program before home programs even existed, and we just kind of built it together. I then went on to get my master's in speech pathology in 1997, and since that time I've worked in a variety of settings. And interestingly, through those years of working in a number of different settings, nothing really fit for me, nothing really resonated, and the models we were using just didn't really fit for me. And that's when I came across the CERTS model. It really resonated with me. And then when we started this organization in 2004, we started it based on the CERTS model and based on that work and based on a developmental approach and an emotional regulation focus. And we've followed that ever since. That has been our guiding light. That's been our focus since the beginning. And then over the last 20 years, our organization has just grown exponentially, and there's so much demand for this type of service that even within I started in January, and by that first summer, we had 40 families already. And now we serve every year hundreds of families, around 500 families across different programs every year.
My goodness. And you do so many things through CASE.
We do lots of different things.
So would you like to just briefly describe kind of the age range and because I think just saying children's autism services doesn't capture the broad range of supports that you provide.
Yeah, it's an organization that provides all kinds of different services. We started off with home programming, so having speech pathologists, occupational therapists, psychologists, behavior consultants in the homes with the families doing specialized services, specialized programs. We also started then after that adding preschool services, so the educational component to it in preschool settings. We added respite as well to our program, and we also do consulting in rural and remote communities through the education side of things as well. And then in 2008 actually was our very first conference that we started offering. And I always joke that Barry was our first speaker at our first conference all those years ago in 2008. And I always blame you, Barry, for it being in January because that's when you were available. So that's when we did our first conference, and then it kind of stuck. And this will be year 17 that we're doing our conference. And it's been in January every year, and convincing people to come to Alberta in Edmonton in January is always a bit of a challenge.
I really, I remember minus 20 Fahrenheit. I remember the ice on the roads and the huge trucks being jackknifed all over the place. Fond memories.
Yeah, it's sometimes pretty cold here in January. It's not always super cold in January. I remember when Emily Rubin came, yes. I said, sometimes it gets down to minus 40. She said, is that Fahrenheit or Celsius? And I said, ooh, the bad news is that it's both. At minus 40 Celsius and Fahrenheit, sorry. So it can get cold, but some years it's not even, it's barely below freezing. So it really varies, but it's always funny to talk about why do we do a conference in January in Alberta? It's Barry's fault. That's when he was available. So we like to joke about that because it's kind of an experience for people to travel to our region.
I've been blamed about a lot of things, but I'll have to add this to my repertoire of what people blame me about. But
the other conference schedule.
Yeah, conference schedule. The other things that we've added recently to our program is we now also do diagnostics, and we also have community events. We call them EPIC. And this year, for the first time, we opened a brand new private school that is specifically designed around the needs of our autistic students. And the building was designed for our students, and we're just starting slow with grades 1 to 3. Or kindergarten to 2 to 3, and we're going to be expanding that over time. But this just started in September, so that's been a new thing for us this year as well. So,
And your connection to families, I know, is vital because from very early on, I remember that you were hand in hand with parents and everything you were developing.
Everything we do is a collaboration with families, and family-centered programming has been a pillar of our organization since the very beginning. We work with the entire family. It's not just that one child. We work with their whole family. And that's always been really important. And even in a school program where traditionally the family is someone on the periphery, we incorporate the collaboration with the families as part of the fabric of what we do. It's important to us.
So important.
Mm-hmm.
So let's really start digging in here. Emotional regulation has always been, such an essential developmental area in your services. I'm just kind of curious, even outside of that being an important domain of the CERTS model, how has that awareness and focus evolved for you over the years as you began to serve children and serve families and hear what parents were saying, especially in contrast to what was, and in some places still is, the predominant way of looking at dysregulation?
Yeah, it's funny. We've always had the core belief, and I've always had the core belief that that this work is about supporting learning. It's not about modifying behavior. It's about supporting that learning, and that's been sort of our core belief. And I've always used the phrase "compliance is not the goal." That's not what we're after. I kind of joke that I'm a relatively non-compliant individual myself. Ask my mother; she knows I'm non-compliant. I've been throughout my life, really. And compliance isn't what we're after. We're after thinking beings, feeling beings. We're after relationships. We're after that trust, that community, that sense of creating contributing citizens. It's not about compliance. Sometimes we think we want compliance, but that's not actually what it's about. So that's always been a core belief of ours, and that's always been something that we've focused on regulation since the beginning. But it's interesting because early on, the term regulation wasn't even, nobody even knew that term. Nobody even knew what dysregulation meant. And now emotional regulation and dysregulation has become so much more common, and it's really evolved to people are really acknowledging the importance of that component, that we can't ignore emotional regulation, and that we need to have that as an important piece of what we do.
Yeah, and just a little plug for certainly one of my CERTS collaborators and a person that you've had present, Dr. Amy Laurent. In terms, the plug is for her TED Talk on compliance and how that, as you have said, is just not, the focus. And we could flip that around and say maybe a term such as self-determination is the more important priority.
Mm-hmm. I always talk about how we need to get rid of our reliance on compliance, because compliance is like junk food. Compliance is a quick and easy fix. But it's like junk food. It's not good for us. It's not good in the long term. Can you impact a child's immediate behavior through compliance-based strategies? Yes. Does it help in the long term? No. So it's kind of like junk food. It's not good for you. It's not going to help in the long term.
Yes.
But it's quick and easy, and sometimes what people go to. So,
yeah, and I will say that of course, this podcast is all about autism and neurodiversity. But I work in a company setting, and I see a lot of people who, it's funny, they would be more compliant subordinates and more productive if they had some understanding of the physiology of regulation and sort of not the tricks, but the methods that people can use to take a dysregulated nervous system and actually self-regulate, self-soothe, stim, even modulate your energy up.
Mm-hmm.
So it's funny, like compliance, quote unquote, is important. I mean, you can't get much done if you're just a wild, untethered cowboy, guns blazing all the time. So of course we need to be able to work together, but you're right. It's that regulation piece that's that enables people to act in a cooperative way.
Yes, and Dave, I'm sure you don't see any dysregulation in the corporate world.
Never. Oh, you wouldn't believe how calm and rational and not fearful the average corporate executive is. Yeah, these.
Well, it really is gaining such a it's getting so much bigger than just neurodiversity. Regulation and emotional regulation is getting to be so much bigger than just in this area. So
it's crazy. Like on my social media feed, and this might be because I assumed it was because I'm married to a life coach who deals a large part of her work, which she actually draws from her being essentially an indirect student of Barry's as a speech and language pathologist. But now that she's and his certs model, but now that she's a life coach, I just assumed it was because, when I'm scrolling through my social media feed, like Instagram, 1 in 3 is some middle-aged person talking about regulation and dysregulation. And I'm like, where are all these experts on regulation? I thought this came from certs.
Well, there
So
were
it's everywhere.
pioneers. There were pioneers who drove this forward, and Barry was one of them. And those pioneers that drove it forward and out, and it really expanded into so many different areas, which I think is great.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
we won't get
Yeah.
into the weeds on this, but my mentors were some of the most important people of the last century in understanding infant development. And they, from the get-go, were talking about regulation and supporting parents of kids who had a wide variety of at-risk infants for a number of different reasons. So, for those listeners that we have who are saying, okay, well, what's emotional regulation in action? Okay. And how much we value stories as a way of kind of making concepts come more clearly and really engaging. Do you have any stories you want to share about any of your students, any of your kids, and how you supported them, especially when regulation was a very, very important priority?
Yeah, I mean, I take a very, just to let people know, I take a very broad definition of emotional regulation for the purposes of this book and for the purposes of my work. Some people see emotional regulation as a subcomponent of certain things, but I use the term in a very, very broad way. And it means to talk about your state, your emotional state, your energy level, your physiological state, as well as your feelings. It's not just emotional regulation is not just about emotions and the emotion words, sad, mad, happy. It's about the broader concept of our emotional state, our energy level, our physiological state. So not everybody uses a really super broad definition of emotional regulation, but that's the definition that I use. And so when we're talking about the emotional state, it's that regulated state where you need to be in that regulated state to learn and grow. It doesn't just mean being calm. It means being matching the environment. So, I talk about in my book, if you're at a hockey game, being calm is not what we need to be. It's everybody is very emotional and very, energized. And so it's matching your emotional state, your arousal state or your emotional regulation with the environment. So the setting. And that's where we need to be in that sort of place of being regulated to be able to learn and grow. And if you're not in that state of emotional regulation, you can't learn and grow. And in the past, we used to think that people could learn and grow no matter what emotional state they were in. They could still learn, they could still go through the drills, and it didn't matter what their emotional regulation state was in. So one of the stories in my book is about a student or a child that I was working with. And he was an older child, about 8 or 9. And we were doing this puzzle, this little wooden puzzle, peg puzzle. And it was too young for him. He didn't like it. He was bored. And so he kept throwing it across the room which to me was pretty clear communication of, I don't like this, I'm bored.
Yes.
So instead of that, because of the program that I was consulting in, the protocol was to physically have him go and pick that up and put it back in. And it didn't matter that he was upset. It didn't matter that he was dysregulated. It didn't matter. He was going to learn to comply. And that was their goal. And they called it a non-preferred activity. And that notion that we just had to make him comply, no matter what his regulation was, was really felt wrong to me. And in the end, and it was a very emotional thing, and I talk about it in the introduction in the book, and I was so upset having to do that. And all I did was destroy the relationship with him by physically forcing him to pick that up while he was fighting against it. I destroyed our relationship. And the only thing I taught him that day was that if I'm bigger than you, I can make you do what I want you to do. That's all I taught him. I didn't teach him anything else. And then, of course, he got bigger, and he got bigger than other people. And he learned that lesson well, that he can now make people do things they don't want to do. And I destroyed my relationship with him. And that for me was really hard. So I learned that if we can really just focus on that emotional regulation, the relationships, and the trust, that really has better outcomes. And one more story about the regulation. A big part of regulation is that sensory piece and being able to regulate your system through sensory strategies. And I on the front of the book, there is a picture of a window, and there's light coming through the window. And the reason I wanted to capture that in a photo is that I remember sitting and watching a child, and they kept saying, "Oh, he won't stop flicking his hands in the air. He won't stop stimming," they called it. He won't stop. And he was flicking his hands through the air and running them through the air. And he wouldn't stop doing that. And I was brought in to get him to stop doing all these behaviors. And so I was watching, and I was trying to figure out what was going on. And I watched, I happened to catch him sitting in a beam of light. And if we see a beam of light, you can see dust everywhere. There's dust all around us all the time. And when he was flicking his hands through the air in that beam of light, the swirls and eddies and designs it was creating in that dust was mesmerizing. So I ended up just sitting and staring at that. And then I reached up and I was doing it in the air myself. And somebody looked over and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Watch, look at the dust coming through. It's fascinating." And then I realized, okay, well, that's what he's watching. And for him, that was calming. That was a calming sensory break that he needed. And following that kind of calming sensory break, he was able to re-engage in the activity. So it was a matter of talking to them about, that's an emotionally regulating time for him. He needs to have that time. Give him that time. Let him have that opportunity to do that. And then he can re-engage. So I wanted to try and capture that a little bit on the cover. It's hard to capture that experience in an image, but that was kind of the design image for the cover was.
I love that. By the way, that paper flap that's around a book, I think they call that a dust jacket, don't they? So it's very apropos of the medium.
That's true. That's a good point.
I was just going to say another lesson from corporate life here is that if anybody thinks that they are not somebody who, if they think that they can't relate to what it means to need a moment of regulation, either up or down, just think about how long do you sit at your desk when something is happening that is starting to frustrate you. Most people will stand up and walk away from their desk for a minute. All of a sudden, they need to use the bathroom. They need to get a drink. They need to get a cup of coffee. I think it doesn't matter what it looks like. We're all doing the same things. It's just, if you're autistic, you're more likely to be flicking your hand in the dust, in the sunbeam, and watching the dust. You're more likely, but we all have this, this tendency.
And your example, and actually both examples, in the corporate setting, as well as Terri's example of the little guy with the dust, it really illustrates that it's not just emotional regulation. Just isn't, okay, how do we help this person be regulated? It also is about seeing strategies that a person already brings in their life to be well regulated, and then making a decision. Is it working for them? Okay. Because as we know, some strategies to try to regulate may not be effective or might be just so distracting or disruptive that we have to support. But then it's not just stop that. It's about, okay, let's help this person build a repertoire and build self-awareness around that. One other quick point, one of our guests Elaine Hall, who also you know well, Terry. She gives the example of when her son Neil was young, and he would get down sometimes outside, and if there was a car with a shiny hubcap, he would kind of get down and stare at it. And, she wasn't sure what was going on. People were saying, oh, that's terrible. It's just an undesirable behavior, until she got down with him. And so the important piece that I'll add to what you're saying, Terry, is you try to understand that child's experience. You really, what we call the deep why. Why is this child doing it? And you have to be there to move on effectively and respectfully in that instance.
Yeah, absolutely. And just recognizing that a lot of these kids do develop regulation strategies, and some of them sometimes have to be shifted. There's some safety issues sometimes, and sometimes you have to shift them, but it's a matter of shifting it to other strategies that also meet that same need, and getting the why and getting it to a strategy that does meet that same need, that isn't unsafe. But also there's a lot of these things where we don't want the kids to do those things, not because it's unsafe, but just because it doesn't fit with their ideas, how things that should be. There was one kid who used to, they called it doing his ABCs, and he would just recite the ABCs over and over and over again. And that recitation, that predictability was calming for him. But they kept saying, oh, it's so intrusive, it's so abnormal, it's so weird. So I helped them to realize it's not the reciting of the ABCs that's the problem. It's where and when. And let's teach him to be able to step away and to be able to have a place. And in fact, he used to also like to walk in circles. So we found a space in the classroom where he could be, when he needed a regulation break, he could go to the back of that classroom, walk in circles and do his ABCs. And then we explained to all of the other students, this is what's calming for him. You know how it's calming for you to hum or to listen to music or whatever you do to calm? This is what's calming for him. So when he's starting to struggle, he needs to step away and do his ABCs and walk. And that was something that it's a little bit of, I always talk about it, it's about both. It's about changing the environment and making some of these things acceptable and allowed in that environment whenever possible. And it's about teaching skills and strategies that the individual can use. And it's about pairing those. It's not about one or the other. It's about both. And I learned that from the CERTS model. It's not just about, the CERTS model was one of the first that identified that those transactional supports in the environment also need to change in addition to the building of skills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what we refer to as there's a time and a place strategy. Mm-hmm. But what you're doing while you're doing it is you're letting the child know, I get you. I get this is something you need to do. And it's not, again, there used to be a website for a private practice in Massachusetts. It was called stopthatbehavior.com. And
oh, jeez.
Literally.
Can we make sure that every politician in the United States gets on that website and learns from it?
And the deep consideration of what is the child's experience, and especially if a child's getting increasingly dysregulated, and then we do something that is just throwing gasoline on the fire. I mean, that's not helpful at all.
No.
And as you said, it interferes with trust and relationships. So important. So
go ahead.
I
wanted to also make one more point on that on emotional regulation. If anybody out there listening is thinking that, so what are they talking about? Just like calming down? That's not it. You don't have to be calm to be regulated. In fact, the regulation is a very deliberate strategy. It's a process, right? When you're not feeling calm, that's when you regulate. It's not the same as just, oh yeah, everything's puppies and bacon and I'm calm. And, because there's also upwards regulation, right? Wiggling your knee if you're needing to pay attention to something, and your system is just in low gear. That happens to me sometimes where I'm like, oh my gosh. So there's, plenty of different. So I also just wanted to make that note in case anybody was mistakenly assuming that we're talking about staying calm. It's not that.
We'd like to take a moment to thank you for listening to Uniquely Human, the podcast. It is so gratifying to hear that so many of you find value in what we share.
It is gratifying, and it's so much fun making this show together, Barry. Being able to meet with you every week and all the guests and listener support that we've received, it's such a joy to make this show. And of course, we are commercial free, but Barry and I would invite you to support this show in a number of different ways. That could be buying our books, or even inviting us to speak live or virtually to your organization or to your community. To learn more about all of this, you can, of course, go to our websites, barrypresent.com or davidjfinch.com, to learn more about our speaking topics and how to work with us and all of the consultative services that we provide.
And we also want to know how we're doing. We are in a constant quality improvement mode here.
Yes.
So please make sure to leave comments and ratings, suggestions on social media. Contact us directly on the links on our website, and recommend Uniquely Human, the podcast, to those in your lives. In conclusion, we are so grateful to you, our Uniquely Human community, for your support and loyalty, and we'll be keeping at it.
Yes, thank you all so much. Now back to the show.
Something that Terri also touched upon is some innovative work doing, and I think you cited in your book of Amy Laurent and Jacqueline Fady, and just relating to what Dave just said, that for some people it may not be the experience of emotion the way neurotypicals experience emotion, but it might be experiencing energy levels, and understanding when you're much too low energy or you're running on fumes, as opposed to, okay, my energy is bubbling and boiling, and that is not conducive for me to be able to learn or to engage with others. So there's so much interesting stuff going on right now in terms of regulation. But I think one piece that a lot of people don't understand, Terri, that I'd love for you to comment on, is that regulation is a developmental process. It's not this one static thing that is an issue or is part of the experience of a 2-year-old. And guess what? For a 15-year-old, regulation, we define it the same way. It looks the same way. Do you want to talk about the developmental piece, especially because you serve kids at very different developmental levels?
Absolutely. It really is about the looking at over the lifespan and looking at regulation over the lifespan and how it changes. We have a very sort of a lifespan approach where we look at very young kids in a very different way. And as they grow and develop into adults, their regulation needs change. So sometimes and often with very young children, it's about giving them more tools and giving them ways to regulate. And sometimes our young kids don't have a toolbox of regulation strategies. They don't know what's going to work and help. And so it's a matter of looking at those things and of looking at the factors that are influencing their regulation, like their sleep and like their nutrition and like their physical activity and, like, do they have anxieties? Do they have, what's their communication like? And so looking at all of those factors that influence their regulation and supporting them to develop tools and strategies. And then as we get older, those will change and the tools and strategies change, and individuals will develop their own that are good fit for their own needs, and for them to learn to read as individuals get older. We often will teach to read their own state, read their regulation, and how is your regulation, and then choosing the tool that's going to fit. So building that ability to self-regulate. But one of the other things that I've learned over the years too, I used to think that first you teach co-regulation and you help regulate. And then once you've helped them regulate, then they do it on their own. But I've recognized in my life in particular, I co-regulate with others all the time. And we don't get rid of co-regulation once we learn to self-regulate. It's not first you do this, then you do this. It's co-regulation and regulating and helping one another regulate happens throughout our lifetimes. And I often rely on others for regulation. My sister is a huge regulation support for me. And always has been, and that's something that that doesn't change over your lifetime. You continue to co-regulate over your lifespan. It just tends to look different at different stages.
Yes. And that also includes knowing who to avoid if they have the opposite effect of helping you regulate.
Those dysregulating influences.
It goes both ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. I find that I've got a lot of those. And probably the biggest dysregulating influence I have is my own brain, because I guarantee it's not the people around me that are the problem if it's more than one. It's probably me.
Well, a good strategy would be to learn how to talk to your brain and say, stop doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and then we get into some of the metacognitive strategies that some of our older kids and some of our adults use. And those are those metacognitive things about the self-awareness, awareness of your body, awareness of your state, and then awareness of your thoughts and awareness of those metacognitive, thinking about our thinking. And if we're thinking about our thinking in that kind of metacognitive way, that brings in different strategies. I had to do a little self-talk earlier today because my computer was changed and it was highly dysregulating for me. And I had to sort of have some self-talk around that. And so, there's some of those more metacognitive strategies are also things that we look at supporting and developing with our youth and our adults.
Yeah, and that self-awareness of knowing, in a sense, what's in your toolbox, what's the range of possibilities. I always like to give the example of if you're going to a very important meeting, maybe it's a job interview, and there's an accident on the freeway or on the road you're going, and everything's all backed up, and you're saying, oh my God, what's going to happen? I'm definitely going to be late. For many of us, it's almost as if we go into this automatic mode. Oh, I could call and tell them there's an accident. I could get off at an earlier exit and take the streets rather than staying on the highway. Oh, I could call my friend who works at that company and let them. We almost automatically talk about 2 or 3 or 4 strategies to reduce the anxiety that we're feeling. And, one of the things, and Terri, you know this, being kind of exposed and being an expert in the CERTS model, is that it's regulation is something that for neurotypicals, and I'm not saying all of us, but for many neurotypicals, we develop strategies that we see other people using. We can assess, is this effective or not effective for me? Do I shift to something else? And I think one of the problems with people with neurodevelopmental differences, and especially autistic people, is sometimes they get locked into 1 or 2 strategies. So if I'm feeling anxious in the classroom because the teacher's talking too fast and too much, I bolt out of the classroom, as opposed to say, I need a break, or saying to yourself, I could ask the teacher afterwards what she was saying. And I think that's an important piece, that expansion of the repertoire that you referred to earlier.
Yeah, and developing that toolkit and developing those options and ways that we can regulate. And that's what I really wanted to make sure that I included as many ways in my book that people can use to regulate as many strategies as possible. And that's really what I wanted to cover. But I think too, the one other point to make is that we're living in a time that is very overwhelming. It is nowadays, and through everything that we've gone through in the past, even in the past decade, there's so much change. There's so many things have happened, even in the last 5 years, that life can be really overwhelming. And sometimes neurotypical folks are getting to that tipping point where they're just so overwhelmed they can't even think of strategies to use, and they can't even think of ways to regulate there are so many people that are overwhelmed and running on on high, running on and slightly dysregulated for most of the day, and that's hard. And that's why I wanted to make sure that there were lots of strategies that neurotypical people can use too and should use. And I gave examples of myself and some of the strategies that I use. And it's not always easy for me to maintain my own emotional regulation, because the world can be a pretty overwhelming place. Mm-hmm. And especially now. And that's why there's so many things that we can do and so many tools. And it's so interesting that we've learned a lot of these tools from neurodiverse individuals and from the needs of those neurodiverse individuals. We've learned that, wow, these things work with all kinds of kids, all kinds of adults. Mm-hmm. And that's what I always talk to teachers about, is that if you are using a strategy for your one particular neurodiverse child, neurodiverse student, if that autistic student responds well to something, try it with all of the others, because it works with them too. And that those regulation strategies, emotional regulation, can benefit all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's the range of attempts. So you got a child, the fire alarm, or the fact that we're 3 minutes past, what we said we were going to be doing right now, that sets a child into sort of that spiral. We've all experienced that many times ourselves. And maybe this week, the thing we tried wasn't the thing. And so next week, rest assured there will be some other thing. There will be somebody pops a paper bag unexpectedly, and now we're back into it. So I think there's always going to be plenty of opportunities. One thing, and I don't want to get stuck in a specific minutia sort of example, but when I think about the metacognitive stuff, is there a clever way that you've found to coach young kids, like children, who elementary school age, we'll say, to coach them to start to be able to think about what they're thinking? Like, or is that such an abstract idea that it's just really difficult to introduce that as a tool for somebody of that age?
There are ways to introduce that with young kids as well. A part of it comes from, often we will start with more body awareness. So if you can think about what your body feels like, then you can get to the point where you can think about what you're thinking. But there's been some really great work, even work that Carol Gray has done with comic strip conversations, and that notion of a thinking bubble above your head, and what are you thinking? And then another person with a thinking bubble over their head, and what are they thinking? And, she's used it as this notion of my thoughts aren't the same as your thoughts, and some of that perspective taking. But we've also used that notion of using thought bubbles to help us identify, what are we thinking? What are the thoughts that are in our heads right now? And if we can use some visual supports for that, if we can use some, and of course it depends on the child and on their developmental level, but using those kinds of supports to help them think about their thinking can be really effective in moving towards regulation strategies that are more metacognitive.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I think one of our mantras is, and I'm going back to CERT, sorry about that, but, is if something is so kind of fleeting and abstract, let's make it more concrete. So at a metacognitive level, it could be if the cafeteria is too loud, and as Terri, as you just said, maybe have some visuals. I could do A, I could ask for a break. I could do B, maybe ask to sit at the quiet table in the corner. I could do C, say it's too loud, please. Whatever might be effective and what might work in that instance. But I think what you're saying also, Terri, and I love the analogy to what a dysregulating world we live in now. It's so important, getting back to the title of your book. Emotional regulation might mean everything. And I think what so many people are feeling now, it just is so illustrated by that. But to operationalize it, we could literally say, what are the dysregulating factors that we are immersed in and exposed to every day? And then what strategies can we use to try to deal with those factors, not be hyper-focused on those factors or whatever?
Yeah, there are a lot of factors that dysregulate us every day, all day, and coming up with the strategies and the tools. The thing too about this kind of an approach is that it's not a cookie cutter. It's not a one size fits all. And because it's not a cookie cutter and a one size fits all, it's hard. We need to individualize. So we do need to look at what are the factors that are dysregulating? Why are they dysregulating? What are some of the things we can do about it? And so it's all about, that detective work and that figuring out things, and then individualizing and trying things. And some things might work and others might not. And that makes it much more difficult because we need to individualize, and it's not the old way of doing, do all of these things and tick them off and here's your program that's done. It's harder, and because it's harder, it then gets more difficult to track, to have data, to have progress, to demonstrate progress. It is a much more difficult approach to use. And, in some ways, a behavioral, the old school discrete trial training stuff where you tick the boxes off after you did your trial, it's easier. It's right or wrong. There's a clear answer. It's easier. It's black and white. This is gray, and it's individualized, and it's harder to do, and it takes a lot deeper thought. We have to really be thoughtful about some of these things. And that makes it a lot harder. But just because it's harder doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I always think of the quote, when you know better, you do better. And we know better now. We know what works better. And we know that this is a better approach. It's a much more humanized, humanistic approach that really focuses on trust and relationships and all of those kinds of things we've talked about. It is the approach that we need to move towards, and we know that the outcomes are better, but it's harder, and we need to acknowledge that it's not easy to do these things. But just because they're not easy to do doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do them, because the neurodiverse individuals that we work with deserve better, and we need to do better, but it's hard.
And if you do look through a developmental lens, you always have to ask, what impact is this strategy that I or our team, what impact does that have on this child's long-term development? So as you said at the very beginning, yeah, we know how to make kids comply, okay? But that would be certain kids. Other kids who have more kind of fire in their belly to be self-determined, it's just throwing more gas on the fire. For other kids, you can have a compliant, depressed child who has very little sense of self because all the control comes from the outside. And they don't have that sense in their lives. So jumping off of that, you do still run into organizations or educational treatment programs that have not yet either been exposed to, or if they've been exposed to an emotion regulation focus, they haven't embraced it. I know we could talk another hour about this, but what would you say to people like that? Or programs?
Well,
like
and again, it comes back to, when we know better, we do better. Sometimes it is just about learning the approach and learning the difference between a compliance-based approach and a more emotional regulation-based approach. But it's also more about, I find that if they can see the outcomes, if they can see the difference in the outcome, that really is, for me, changing hearts and minds means showing them it matters and it makes a difference. And so we will often go into a classroom and work with one child and show them the change. And when they see that change, they then want to become champions of this and use it with all kinds of kids. So, sometimes it's that one by one kind of change that really matters for people. But it really is about making sure that they understand that we all do things differently as we grow and learn. And it's not bad that we did those things in the past. I made a ton of mistakes all throughout my career, all along. Everybody does. And now we know that there are better ways to do things. And now we've learned. And as we learn that there are better ways to do things, we need to shift our practice and grow and change. And there are still those who want that very concrete, control-based, compliance-based approach. And it's a matter of really showing them what a difference it can make when we do shift that control to the child, where we do shift away from that power struggle. And, I think in a way, deep down, all of us know that is a better approach. It is a more humanizing and respectful approach, and it is more of a neurodiversity affirming approach. And when we know that and we head in that direction, I think people can change and grow and learn. It just takes time and patience and compassion, really.
And isn't
well,
it
and
the
it's
case?
such an importance. I was going to say, not only for functioning in society the way that society needs us to when we become adults and even when we're kids, but it's so important to develop this habit of regulation and the tools and strategies that come with it. If for nothing else, than to avoid the pitfalls of chemical dependency when you become an adult. Like the people who are feeling so that it's pushing the dysregulation down until 5 o'clock, and then they open up the bottle, and then they're drunk the rest of the night, right? And then they wake up tomorrow, wash, rinse, repeat. So it can be a real life-changing skill to have to avoid those trappings.
Mm-hmm. And isn't it also sometimes, I'm going back to younger kids now, that it's the parents who lead the way. The parents who say, well, I've been told that when my child does this, I see it as my child being in distress, and I've been told to ignore the behavior, and I just can't. I see it as my child being in distress, and I need to provide that co-regulation, or we use the term mutual regulation as well, because that's my parental instinct. I want my child to be well regulated, and a child is not going to go from a dysregulated state to being well regulated unless they have good self-regulatory abilities by ignoring the behavior. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah. And sometimes we need to give parents and caregivers permission to follow their instincts, because they've been told all of these things by lots of different people. And I'm often letting parents know, yes, you need to follow your instincts. You've got, you want to help them in this moment of distress. And that is the way to go. And making sure that they understand that, they can follow those instincts.
Yes. Yeah. So what do you see, just looking forward into the future? It just strikes me that one of the areas of supporting neurodivergent kids and families is one of the most fertile areas is this emotional regulation area. That, thank goodness, the field has really dove into this just in recent years, and we're still learning. It's relatively new, at least within, kids with neurodevelopmental differences. It's been around, for some time for typically developing kids, understanding the notion of regulation. But what do you see as some of the major challenges, questions? Where are we going with all of this? Or where do you hope to see us going?
Well, I'm optimistic that we have seen a broader acceptance of this concept. Because I used to feel a little bit like there were a few of us out there as, lone voices in the wind trying to shift in this direction. And I feel like we have shifted. And because of those pioneers out there, we've shifted the way we practice, and we've shifted the way that we support students and adults. So I feel optimistic that we're going to continue down that path and continue in the right direction. And really, I see us embracing this concept to deal with that overwhelm. The overwhelm is not going to go away. We're not going to all of a sudden live in a less overwhelming world. But what I'm hopeful about is that despite the fact that our world gets more and more overwhelming, sometimes more and more information, more and more diverse with all kinds of things coming at us, that we are able to continue to build those toolboxes and those ways of managing our emotional regulation. And I think that if we can all continue to build those strategies and those tools to manage dysregulation, then we can continue to progress as communities and move forward as communities. I feel like this is something that shifts everyone in the right direction. And if we can just keep going, sometimes I say that as long as we're facing the right direction, we're maybe not moving forward as fast as we'd like, but as long as we're facing the right direction, we're okay. But I do feel optimistic that this does, that these kind of things are changing, and we are starting to improve our ability to regulate as communities.
So important and so needed. And I just wanted to drop one more little concept that maybe we'll do a whole focus on in the future, which is all about regulation. And that is trauma-informed work. Once we get to people who are exposed to circumstances in their lives that what they experience is so extreme that basically they're traumatized by that. And we know that's become a huge issue in the autism and neurodivergent community. So,
although interestingly, I did feel ever since the beginning, we talk about trauma-informed therapy. I've always felt like the CERTS model is a trauma-informed model, even before trauma-informed therapy was a word.
I agree.
It's always been trauma-informed and neurodiversity affirming. So we have that already as one of our tools. And I do talk a little bit about trauma in the book. I touch on it very briefly, but it is just such a fascinating topic. Yeah.
And an example, again, of people outside of our professions and our field have done a much deeper dive into that. And it's time to really look carefully and not what I refer to as kind of superficial lip service. Oh, yeah, we're trauma-informed. It is such a deep look at human development and brain behavior relationships and emotional memory and so many things that we know are very, very important in a person's development. So... Well, Terri, this has been eye-opening. As you could see, we could go on.
As always, yes.
I hope our listeners found this episode most regulating.
That's right. That's right. And thank you for the gift of your book, Why Emotional Regulation Might Mean Everything. And our listeners can... go to the Neurodiversity Press website to order it, or it'll be on Amazon as well, I believe. I know Michael wasn't thrilled about that because Michael believes in independent publishing. But he finally said, we have to get this out to as many people as possible, right?
Yeah.
And so big congratulations. And
thank you so much. And thank you so much for your kind words and for the foreword. That was so meaningful to me. It just meant a lot that you did that. And you've been such an influence in my career and the trajectory that really meant a lot.
Great. Oh, and we all learn together, don't we? Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you. Be well. Take care.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.